In 1835, one of the most famous men in America stood before the voters who had just ended his career and gave them a farewell that would echo for centuries. "You may all go to hell, and I will go to Texas." This wasn't just the sour parting shot of a defeated politician. This was a living legend, the bear-hunting congressman from Tennessee, turning his back on everything he knew. It was a self-imposed exile that would lead him, just a few months later, to his death in a dusty Texas mission. The question that chills the bone isn't how he died at the Alamo, but why he went there in the first place. How does a man at the absolute peak of his fame find himself so utterly alone, cast out by his own party, his own president, and his own people? The answer lies not in a battle with rifles, but in a brutal war of conscience fought on the floor of the US Congress, an act of political suicide that sealed his fate long before he ever crossed the Sabine River. Today, we will answer that question. We will find the real Davy Crockett. To understand the man who would defy a president, you have to understand the world that forged him. David Crockett was born in 1786 on the banks of the Nolichucky River in what is now East Tennessee. This was not yet America as we know it. It was a raw, unforgiving frontier, a world of misty mountains, deep forests, and a people as tough and unyielding as the landscape itself. Appalachia was a crucible, and it burned away everything that was not essential, leaving behind only grit, self-reliance, and a fierce independence. The people who settled these hills, largely Scots-Irish immigrants, brought with them a deep cultural memory. They remembered kings and landlords from across the sea, and they carried a profound distrust for any distant, centralized authority. Their laws were simpler, etched into their hearts rather than written in books. A man's word was his bond. Your loyalty was to your family, your clan, and your neighbor. Justice was swift and personal. This was the code Crockett grew up with, a worldview that saw the world in stark, clear terms of right and wrong, honor and shame. Crockett was the living embodiment of this spirit. He had almost no formal schooling, learning his letters, as he said, from the trees. His real education came from the wilderness. He wasn't just a hunter, he was a provider, a protector. His almost mythical reputation for hunting bears wasn't just a story for entertainment, it was a resume. Killing over 100 bears in a single season meant providing security and sustenance for the entire community. In a world where survival was a daily struggle, a man with those skills was a natural-born leader. His charisma was just as wild and untamed. He didn't speak in the polished tones of the Virginia aristocracy. He spoke the language of the common man, full of homespun humor, sharp wit, and captivating stories of his adventures. He could hold a crowd spellbound with a tale of tracking a bear through a blizzard or facing down a panther in the dark. He was one of them, a man who understood their struggles because he lived them every single day. But this very world, the source of all his strength, also contained a fatal vulnerability. Crockett's character was like Appalachian oak, strong, solid, and completely inflexible. He was governed by that simple frontier code of honor. He believed a promise was a promise, whether made to a white settler or a Cherokee chief. He believed that a man's integrity was his most valuable possession, worth more than land, title, or political power. This man, this living piece of the American frontier, was about to be transplanted into the serpentine world of Washington, D.C. He was taking his mountain code of honor into an arena of backroom deals, party loyalties, and brutal political calculus. He didn't know it yet, but the very principles that made him a hero in Tennessee would make him a target in the nation's capital. His own unshakable sense of right and wrong was the shadow that was beginning to gather, unseen and unspoken, over his entire future. When Davy Crockett arrived in Washington, D.C., he entered a wilderness far more dangerous than any he had known in Tennessee. This was a political swamp, thick with ambition, veiled threats, and hidden allegiances. And at the center of this swamp, A storm was gathering around one single, explosive piece of legislation: President Andrew Jackson's Indian Removal Act of 1830. On paper, it was a proposal to relocate the 5 civilized tribes, the Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole, from their ancestral lands in the southeast to new territory west of the Mississippi. The scene itself was charged with a heavy, ominous energy. The first and most powerful clue was the president himself. Andrew Jackson was not a man to be trifled with. His will was iron, and his temper was legendary. This bill was not just policy to him. It was a personal crusade, the culmination of a lifetime spent fighting Native American tribes. His entire political machine, the most powerful in the nation, was mobilized behind it. To the casual observer, the outcome was a foregone conclusion. But as investigators of the past, we must look closer at the clues. In the taverns and boarding houses where congressmen gathered, the whispers were not of national security or manifest destiny. The whispers were of land. Fertile, black soil in Georgia and Alabama, perfect for cotton. Land that was legally owned by the Cherokee and Creek, but desperately coveted by white settlers and wealthy speculators. The air was thick with the scent of greed, a motive far older and more powerful than any political ideology. The initial findings pointed to an open and shut case. The president wanted the land, the party wanted to please the president, and a powerful coalition of land-hungry states demanded action. The political mathematics were simple and brutal. There was no room for dissent. The scene spoke of an unstoppable force, a political juggernaut that would crush anything in its path. And yet, this is where the mystery truly begins. The wilderness of Washington offered no easy answers, only a multitude of unsettling questions. Chief among them, who in their right mind, and especially who from Jackson's own party, would be foolish enough to stand in the way? As the battle lines were drawn over the Indian Removal Act, all eyes in Washington turned to the most obvious source of opposition: the president's sworn political enemies. This was the anti-Jackson coalition, a formidable group of political titans like Henry Clay of Kentucky and Daniel Webster of Massachusetts. They were the established Eastern elite, men who viewed Andrew Jackson not as a hero of the common man, but as a dangerous backwoods tyrant trampling on the Constitution. Their motive for opposing the bill was clear, public, and deeply personal. The feud between Jackson and men like Clay was the central drama of the age. It was a vicious political war fought over the national bank, tariffs, and the very soul of the American Republic. For them, the Indian Removal Act was just another battlefield. Opposing it was not just a matter of policy. It was a chance to land another blow against a president they despised. Everyone in Washington knew about the bad blood between these men. It was a political feud that had burned hot for years and showed no signs of cooling. The initial evidence seemed to confirm their role as the sole antagonists. The first powerful speeches against the bill thundered from their corner of the Senate. The most eloquent constitutional arguments, the most dire warnings of national dishonor, were crafted by them. Whispers quickly spread from their closed-door meetings, and friendly newspapers began printing editorials that painted the president's plan as a moral abomination. To any observer, the story was simple. This was Andrew Jackson versus his political rivals. It was a straightforward, predictable fight. No one, least of all the president, was looking for an enemy within his own ranks. While President Jackson focused his fury on his political rivals, the real threat to his agenda was not in the Senate chambers of Henry Clay, but in the rough-hewn form of one of his own men. The most dangerous dissent, the kind that can break a cause from the inside out, came from a completely unexpected source: Congressman Davy Crockett of Tennessee. No one suspected him. He was a Jackson man, through and through, a fellow Tennessean, a veteran of the Creek War who had served under Old Hickory himself, and the living embodiment of the frontier spirit that had swept the president into office. He was trusted like a brother in arms. But Crockett carried a secret, a motive that was utterly invisible to the political operators in Washington. It wasn't greed, jealousy, or a hidden ambition for higher office. His motive was his conscience. He had lived too close to the land and the people Jackson sought to remove. He had seen the Cherokee Nation firsthand, with their farms, their written language, and their constitution. He had fought alongside Native Americans and against them, and he respected them as people, not as obstacles on a map. For Crockett, this wasn't about clearing land for cotton. It was about a promise being broken, a treaty being trampled, and an act of profound injustice being committed in the name of progress. Looking back, his party colleagues would have seen the signs. As the debate raged, Crockett grew quiet. His usual booming laughter and endless supply of tall tales were replaced by a grim-faced contemplation. He was seen speaking not with party bosses, but with missionaries who had lived among the Cherokee. His questions in the cloakrooms became pointed, not about political advantage, but about morality and honor. His grief, if you could call it that, wasn't theatrical. It was a deep, simmering anger that his colleagues mistook for backwoods confusion. They saw a simple frontiersman struggling with complex policy. They failed to see a man whose entire moral compass was screaming that his own side was wrong. Beyond the personal rivalries and internal betrayals, a third, far more powerful force was at play. This was not a single man or a political party, but a vast, impersonal economic juggernaut with an insatiable appetite, the Cotton Kingdom. The real pressure for Indian removal wasn't coming from the White House alone. It was coming from the relentless thrum of textile mills in Manchester, England, and Lowell, Massachusetts. A global revolution in industry had created an unprecedented demand for cotton, and the American South was its primary supplier. The motive was as simple and potent as profit itself. The old cotton lands of the Carolinas were becoming exhausted, and the planters looked westward with hungry eyes. The fertile, well-watered lands of the Cherokee, Creek, and Choctaw in Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi were the prize. This wasn't a local squabble. It was a matter of economic destiny for the entire Southern establishment. The value of the land wasn't measured in tradition or ancestral right, but in dollars per acre and bales per season. This massive, faceless entity had a single, overriding interest: acquire that land by any means necessary. This external threat created a suffocating climate of inevitability. Long before the bill was debated in Congress, the pressure was being felt on the ground. Land speculators, the quiet agents of this economic empire, were already appearing in the valleys. They were not local men, and they carried an air of quiet menace. They brought maps and surveying chains, making offers that were more like warnings. Their presence sent a clear message to everyone, including the Cherokee and politicians like Crockett. This was no longer a negotiation. A tidal wave of money and power was coming, and it intended to wash away everything in its path. In the beginning, the opposition to the Indian Removal Act pursued what seemed to be a clear and righteous path. The first great charge was a legal one, led by the sharpest constitutional minds in the country. They brandished copies of treaties signed in good faith by the United States government that explicitly guaranteed the Cherokee and other tribes their lands forever. On the floor of the Senate, men like Daniel Webster laid out a powerful, logical case. A treaty was the supreme law of the land, and to break it was to break the nation's honor. This seemed like the most promising lead, a direct trail to defeating the bill. But they were tracking a ghost through a legal wilderness. The Jackson administration, with ruthless efficiency, argued that they were not dealing with truly sovereign nations, but with domestic dependent nations living within the borders of the United States. It was a brutal legal sleight of hand, a way of saying that all those promises, all those sacred oaths, could be erased by a simple act of Congress. The trail of constitutional law, which seemed so clear and bright, vanished into the thickets of raw political power. The opposition's most potent weapon had proven to be a dud. Another trail seemed far more promising, the path of simple human decency. Missionaries and religious leaders who had lived among the tribes came to Washington, painting a vivid picture of the civilization Jackson sought to destroy. They spoke of the Cherokees' alphabet, their written constitution, their neat farms and Christian churches. Surely, they argued, a moral nation could not uproot a people who had done everything asked of them to assimilate. This appeal to conscience was aimed directly at the heart of the American people. But this lead, too, evaporated like morning mist on a hot summer day. Against the deafening roar of progress and the siren song of free land for white settlers, the quiet voices of conscience were drowned out. The narrative of the savage Indian, holding back the tide of civilization, was a far more powerful story for many Americans. The moral high ground turned out to be a swamp of public indifference and racial prejudice. With every failed argument and every evaporating lead, a deep frustration set in among the bill's opponents. For a man like Crockett, watching his own party orchestrate this assault on reason and honor, the feeling must have been one of growing desperation. They were firing paper bullets at a stone wall. The fear in the Cherokee Nation grew into outright terror as they watched their powerful allies in Washington fail one by one. The air in the capital grew heavy and cold. The investigation was going nowhere, and the monster was getting closer. As the vote on the Indian Removal Act drew near, a suffocating silence fell over President Jackson's Democratic Party. This wasn't the quiet of contemplation, it was the chilling silence of a political omerta. Within the party ranks, a brutal and unspoken code was enforced. You were either with the president or you were against him. There was no middle ground, no room for debate, no space for a troubled conscience. Congressmen who had private doubts saw nothing wrong with the bill. Those who questioned its morality heard nothing of injustice, and those who knew it was a betrayal knew nothing but the importance of party loyalty. The primary reason for this silence was fear, pure and simple. The fear of one man, Andrew Jackson. His reputation for political vengeance was as legendary as his military victories. To cross Old Hickory was to be marked for destruction. It was said that upon hearing of Crockett's wavering, the president flew into a white-hot rage, vowing to see the Tennessean politically buried in a graveyard of his own making. This was no idle threat. The Jackson machine was a weapon, and it was aimed directly at anyone who broke ranks. Party leaders, acting as enforcers, would quietly remind a wavering congressman of the patronage jobs, the committee appointments, and the campaign funds that could vanish overnight. But it wasn't just fear. For many, it was a deep-seated loyalty to their own kind and a profound suspicion of the opposition. The men arguing against the bill were the Eastern elites, Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, the very establishment figures Jackson had been elected to fight. For a Western Democrat to side with them against their own president felt like a betrayal of the entire frontier movement. It was seen as siding with the bankers against the farmers, with the city lawyers against the common man. They believed their form of justice was to secure a future for white settlers, and the Indian Removal Act was the necessary tool. In this atmosphere, Davy Crockett became a pariah. The psychological toll was immense. Former friends and allies, men who had swapped stories and shared drinks with him just weeks before, now averted their eyes in the hallways of the capital. He was shunned like a man carrying a plague. Private messages were sent, begging him to reconsider, warning him that he was throwing away a brilliant career for a lost cause. Every handshake he was denied, every conversation that stopped when he entered a room was a reminder of his isolation. Like old Martha in the mountains whose barn was burned for speaking the truth, Crockett was about to have his entire political life burned to the ground. And still, he refused to be silent. The political battle had been fought to a standstill. Arguments had been made, threats had been whispered, and loyalties had been tested. The Jackson machine, confident in its power, believed it had crushed all meaningful dissent. They assumed that in the final moment, party discipline would prevail. They had overlooked the most critical clue of all, a detail hidden in plain sight: Davy Crockett's unbending Appalachian character. It wasn't a piece of paper or a hidden object. It was the man's soul. and it was about to be laid bare for the entire nation to see. The turning point came not in a secret meeting, but in the full public glare of the House of Representatives. As the final debate on the Indian Removal Act took place, Crockett rose to speak. The chamber fell into a hush. This was the moment of truth. He wasn't supposed to speak. He was supposed to fall in line, to cast his vote with the party and save his career. Instead, he unleashed the one piece of evidence that would change everything, a verbal confession not of a crime, but of a conviction. He looked directly at his fellow congressmen, men who had shunned him and pressured him, and he spoke not of politics, but of honor. "I have been charged with not representing my constituents," he declared, his frontier drawl cutting through the tense silence. "I did not come here to represent my constituents alone. I am a servant of the American people. Justice and honor are my guides." In that single moment, the forgotten clue of his personal code was slammed down on the table. He was stating, unequivocally, that his conscience was a higher authority than his party, his president, or even the people who elected him. The effect was electric. It was a stunning public rebuke of the president from within his own ranks. Suddenly, the perception of Davy Crockett shifted dramatically. He was no longer just a quirky backwoodsman. He was a rebel. The words he spoke were more damning than any secret diary or misplaced letter. They exposed the truth not of a conspiracy, but of one man's solitary, defiant stand. For the Jacksonians, the revelation was horrifying. Their simple story of party unity was shattered. And with that speech, a new and urgent mission began: the complete and total political destruction of Davy Crockett. The air in the House of Representatives was thick enough to cut with a knife. The final vote on the Indian Removal Act had arrived. This was the moment where whispers ended and legacies were forged in iron. The roll call began, a death march of names echoing in the tense, silent chamber. One by one, Jackson's men, many with visible reluctance, answered yea. They chose their party. They chose their careers. They chose their president. The wall of silence was holding. Then the clerk's voice cut through the air. "Crockett." For a heartbeat there was nothing. Then a voice clear and steady filled the room with a single defiant word: nay. It was more than a vote. It was the sound of a political career committing suicide. It was the roar of an Appalachian conscience that refused to be silenced. In that instant, every man in the room understood the price Crockett had just willingly paid. But it was not enough. The bill passed by a razor-thin margin, just 5 votes. Davy Crockett's personal honor was intact, but the fate of the 5 tribes was sealed. And with the smoke of that final battle still clearing, the true culprits behind this national tragedy were finally and irrevocably unmasked. The mastermind was, and always had been, President Andrew Jackson. His motive was not a fleeting political whim, but the culmination of a lifetime of frontier warfare and a chillingly clear vision of an expanding white America built on the ashes of broken treaties and displaced peoples. His was the iron will that drove the entire affair, the hand that held the dagger. The weapon he wielded was his own Democratic Party. Their motive was not malice, but a toxic combination of fear and ambition. They were not evil men, but they were terrified men, bound by a pact of loyalty that demanded they sacrifice their own morals for the sake of political survival. They were the ones who held the victim down, their silence the most damning testimony of all. But the true dark heart of the matter, the motive that fueled both the president's vision and the party's fear, was the vast, impersonal hunger of the Cotton Kingdom. It was not a feud, not a personal vendetta, but the cold, relentless logic of profit. The land was valuable, and the people living on it were in the way. That was the simple, horrifying truth that had been unmasked. In defying all 3, Davy Crockett had not just lost a vote. He had made an enemy of the most powerful forces in America, and they would now see him destroyed. The passage of the Indian Removal Act was not a sudden explosion. It was the slow, deliberate turning of a key in a lock, sealing tens of thousands of people inside a tomb. The ink on the law was barely dry when its poison began to seep into the red clay soil of Georgia, Alabama, and Tennessee. The America that Davy Crockett had fought for, a land he believed was founded on honor, was about to commit a crime in slow motion, a crime whose consequences would stain the pages of history forever. To understand what was lost, you must first see what was there. The Cherokee Nation was not a collection of primitive huts in a dark wilderness. A traveler passing through their lands in 1830 would have seen a nation mirroring the one that was about to destroy it. They would have seen neat, prosperous farms with squared log cabins and smoke curling from stone chimneys. They would have seen fields of corn and cotton with plows that cut straight, proud furrows in the earth. They had their own schools, their own churches, a written alphabet, and a constitution modeled on that of the United States. This was the world that was declared illegal. Then the soldiers came. They came not as liberators, but as jailers. The first sign was not a gunshot, but the unnatural sound of marching boots on a quiet country road, the jingle of military harnesses where there should have been the lowing of cattle. A dread, cold and heavy, settled over the valleys. The world of the Cherokee began to shrink, compressed into small, guarded stockades, a prelude to the long journey ahead. The roundup itself was a scene of quiet, systematic heartbreak. Imagine a family sitting down to dinner, the smell of cornbread in the air. Then, the sound of a heavy boot on the porch, a door kicked open without a word. There was no battle, only the chilling finality of an order given. The family would be forced to stand up and walk away, leaving the food to grow cold on the table, leaving a Bible open on a mantelpiece, leaving a child's doll lying forgotten in a corner. The children, frozen in terror, saw only the grim faces of the soldiers and the tears in their mothers' eyes. They covered their ears, but it didn't help. The world had turned into a hell of sudden orders, followed by a ringing, ghostly silence as home after home was emptied. Then came the march. History calls it the Trail of Tears, but it was a river of sorrow flowing west. It began with the shuffling of thousands of feet, the creak of overloaded wagons, and the crying of children that never seemed to stop. The biting wind of the winter cut through their thin blankets. The freezing rain turned the trail into a thick, sucking mud that pulled at their moccasins and stole the strength from their legs. The old and the sick, unable to keep up, would simply lie down by the side of the trail, their passing marked only by a shallow, hastily dug grave. Davy Crockett was not there to witness this. He was in Washington, a political ghost haunting the halls of the Capitol. But this horrifying procession was the physical embodiment of his every warning. This was the vision that had kept him awake at night, the nightmare he had sacrificed his entire career to prevent. Each snap of a twig under a soldier's boot was an echo of the speaker's gavel. Every shallow grave dug in the frozen earth was a testament to the votes cast against him. This was the national dishonor he had screamed about, now written not in ink, but in the frozen tears of a people betrayed. Davy Crockett's trial did not take place in a courthouse of brick and mortar. His courtroom was the dusty town squares and stump-speaking platforms of West Tennessee during the election of 1835. The charge, laid out in venomous ink by every Jackson-friendly newspaper, was political treason. The prosecution was the full, terrifying weight of the president's political machine, which had sent money, organizers, and a hand-picked candidate, Adam Huntsman, to see Crockett destroyed. The jury was the very people he had once called his friends and neighbors. The atmosphere was electric with tension. This wasn't a campaign, it was a political blood feud playing out in public. The prosecution's case was simple and brutal. Crockett had betrayed them. He had sided with the Eastern elites against their president, their party, and their own interests. His vote on the Indian Removal Act was painted not as an act of conscience, but as a direct assault on the dreams of every poor farmer who wanted a piece of that land. They branded him an arrogant traitor who had forgotten the common man. Crockett's reaction to these charges was not one of remorse or quiet defense. He showed nothing but defiant, thunderous contempt. He didn't plead his case, he prosecuted his accusers. He climbed onto the stump and spat his defiance at the Jackson machine, mocking the president as King Andrew I and daring the voters to cast their ballots for a man who would be a mere puppet. He didn't run from his vote on the Indian Removal Act, he owned it. He held it up as a badge of honor, a symbol of his integrity, and he challenged the jury of his peers to show that they valued honor as much as he did. On election day, the verdict came in. David Crockett was found guilty. He lost the election to Huntsman by a narrow margin. The Jackson machine had succeeded. The bear-hunting congressman had been politically executed, cast out into the wilderness by his own people. But this was not justice. It was a political assassination. The verdict was a product of a trial utterly corrupted by outside influence, a result bought with a flood of presidential power and money. It was a verdict that would spark arguments in those hills for generations to come, a bitter debate over whether a representative's first duty is to his own conscience or to the immediate desires of the people who elect him. In the end, Davy Crockett did not accept the verdict quietly. He stood before the people who had condemned him and delivered his own final judgment, the legendary farewell that would become his epitaph. "You may all go to hell, and I will go to Texas." He had lost the trial, but he walked away a free man, finally unshackled from the system that had tried to break him. For David Crockett, the verdict of the 1835 election was not just a political defeat, it was a spiritual severing. It cut the taproot that connected him to the people and the land that had defined his entire existence. He was a man without a tribe, a legend who had been voted into irrelevance. This rejection haunted him far more than any bear or political rival ever could. His journey to Texas was not merely a search for new adventure, it was a desperate flight from a world that no longer had a place for his code of honor. He went west, looking for a new frontier where a man's word still meant something, a place where he could fight for a cause he believed in without being branded a traitor. His political death in Tennessee was the direct cause of his physical death at the Alamo just a few months later. One fate was inextricably tied to the other. The victors, President Andrew Jackson and his party, also found their destinies forever altered. They had won. The Indian Removal Act was law, and the lands of the Southeast were open to white settlement, cementing Jackson's legacy as a powerful and decisive leader. But it was a poisoned victory. The horrific reality of the Trail of Tears, the deaths of thousands on that forced march, became an indelible stain on his presidency. History would forever bind his name not just to the victory at New Orleans, but to this act of calculated cruelty. His life was changed from that of a simple American hero to a figure of immense and troubling complexity. For the Cherokee, Choctaw, and other tribes, their lives were shattered beyond recognition. They survived, but as a shadow of their former nations, scattered in a strange new territory far from the sacred ground of their ancestors. They carried with them the trauma of the stockades and the ghosts of those lost along the trail. The political decision made in Washington became a wound carried in the hearts of their people for generations, a story of betrayal and loss that would be told around their own campfires for a century to come. And what of the people of Tennessee, the voters who had cast Crockett out? They got what they wanted. The land was opened and a new wave of settlement and prosperity followed. But their lives, too, were changed. They had traded a man of unbending principle for a man of party loyalty. In local law, some say a quiet shame settled over those hills, a lingering memory of the great man they had rejected. They had silenced the one voice who dared to tell them a hard truth, and in doing so, they became complicit in the tragedy that followed. No one, from the president in the White House to the smallest farmer in a Tennessee holler, escaped the consequences of that fateful vote. Even now, nearly 200 years later, the echoes of this story are not hard to find. The name Davy Crockett is carved into the American landscape. You can walk through his replica birthsite cabin in East Tennessee, a humble structure of rough-hewn logs that feels charged with the energy of his spirit. Statues in his likeness stand in town squares, often depicting the mythical hero, rifle in hand. But the most powerful and most tragic, tangible remnant of this era is the land itself. The Trail of Tears is now a national historic trail, a scar of memory that stretches for more than 2,000 miles. It is marked by quiet roadside plaques, preserved segments of old roads, and lonely, often unmarked graves that lie just beneath the surface of the modern world, silent witnesses to an epic of sorrow. Culturally, the story has been told in two vastly different ways. One is the roaring campfire legend of Davy Crockett, king of the wild frontier. It's a story immortalized in song and on screen, a comforting myth of a simple, grinning hero in a coonskin cap. That legend, powerful as it is a shadow. The true story, the one we have told today, is the one whispered in the halls of Congress and preserved in the dry, brittle pages of the official record, the story of a man's lonely, costly stand for his own conscience. For the descendants of the 5 tribes, the story is not a legend. It is a living memory, a foundational trauma that has shaped their identity for generations. It is told not in folk songs for entertainment, but in their own languages, passed from grandparent to grandchild as a testament to their resilience and survival. It is the story of who they are, where they came from, and what they overcame. It is a fire that has never gone out. The world might remember the cartoon, but the Appalachian Mountains themselves hold the memory of the man. His story is etched into the very character of the place, a permanent reminder that deep within these hills, a code of honor can sometimes grow that is stronger than politics, more unyielding than a president's will, and more enduring than a man's own life. The mountains remember the man who stood alone, and they do not forget. So we return to the question that started it all. Why did one of the most famous men in America turn his back on his country and march toward his own death in Texas? The answer, we now know, is far more complex than a simple thirst for adventure. Davy Crockett didn't just go to Texas. He was driven from a United States that had broken his heart. He went because his government had chosen greed over honor, his party had chosen loyalty over justice, and his own people had chosen land over the man who tried to tell them the truth. The Alamo was not his destination. It was simply the last stop on a desperate journey to find a piece of the world that still lived by the code he understood. This is a story not just of a crime against a people, but of the brutal, soul-crushing cost of conscience. It serves as a chilling lesson in how the machinery of power can isolate, demonize, and ultimately destroy a person who dares to stand in its way. Davy Crockett's stand teaches us that the most profound acts of bravery don't always happen on the battlefield with a rifle in hand. Sometimes they happen in a quiet chamber with a single lonely vote in a cause you know is already lost. It is a testament to the idea that true integrity is measured not by the victories you win, but by the principles you refuse to surrender, even in total defeat. The world may have forgotten the real David Crockett, preferring the simple cartoon in a coonskin cap. But his true story is the one America needs to remember. It is the story of a flawed, stubborn man from the mountains who, at a moment of supreme moral crisis, chose to be an honest man rather than a successful politician. He lost his career, his home, and ultimately his life, but he never lost his honor. And now, my friends, you know the rest of the story, or at least as much of it as the mountains are willing to give up.